Welcome to ACF Capital Pulse. This episode, we're focusing on specialty chemicals industry. Specialty chemicals are driving innovation in chemical production. Consumer demand is driving this. But why should this sometimes forgotten, or dare I say, unsexy sector be of significant interest? We have Christopher Nicholson here to discuss. How are you, Christopher?
I'm very well, Scott. It's always a pleasure to be here with Your Finance TV and doing Capital Pulse. We look forward to it.
So do I. Okay, so let's jump into it. Why should investors be interested in specialty chemicals?
Well, as you said, it is kind of an unsexy sector. I mean, it's not Nvidia, et cetera, et cetera. It's not Bitcoin. So sometimes we feel like it gets a little bit forgotten, but actually we think it's a really, really interesting sector. And because it gets a little bit forgotten, there's loads of value in that. That's our view. And really at this point, there's some really interesting developments happening. So you touched on the fact that they're really being driven by changes now in consumer demand. So consumers are demanding sustainability within their products. So what's happening is the way the value chain works is that the specialty chemicals companies, they buy raw materials on the downstream, and then they sell up their formulations, their innovations, and their IP. They sell that up to companies like Unilever, who then put it in their products and then start telling consumers, yes, we're listening to you. We are changing our products. So you've got a moment of change and innovation. And when that happens, the people actually creating innovations, they tend to be able to improve their margins. And if they're protecting it with IP, then of course they have even more control out of that. And of course, when you're innovating, it is difficult to get formulated out. You can be replaced, of course, but there's a brand impact sometimes for that.
Christopher, should specialty chemicals remain in that unloved bucket? Like, what can the sector ever be popular with investors?
It's a great question because it sounds like a huge ask because it's complicated. There are many, many subsegments, but I think it can. And the reason I think it can is that I want to give you an example here. So if you think about what you might call the kind of grooming space, or the personal care space. So in face cream products, for example, I think actually in pretty much 95% of those personal care products, there is a chemical compound referred to as a surfactant, which has a particular role. So it's about 95% of those compounds contain that. And you can make a surfactant essentially in one of two ways. You can use natural gas as the feedstock, or you can use a bioproduct, bioethanol, as the feedstock. Now, at the moment, the vast majority of surfactants are using the natural gas product. Now, consumers may not be fully familiar with the feedstocks, but what they are saying to the big retail consumer brands and to the small independents, and this is something we'll come on to, which is really interesting now, and to the small independents, they are saying, we want sustainability. We are interested in ESG. And are you tracking the chain? They're not expressing it quite the way I'm saying it, but this is what they're demanding. And we know this because these kind of companies that are filling the shelves in supermarkets with brands and big chain stores, and also the new specialty independent retailers that are coming up in this sector, they are telling the specialty chemical companies, we need a formulation that meets these criteria. So there's driving change. So because it's consumers, because that's retail investors, we think that there is a possibility that it could, potentially become a really sexy sector. I know everybody who sees this will laugh when I say that at the moment, but I'm going to put I don't know, I'll put $10 on it. It will become a sexy sector in the next 5 years.
All right, so how are specialty chemicals enhancing the efficacy and safety of health and hygiene products?
So what they're really doing is the mandates that the specialty chemicals companies are getting, or that they are bringing to the table, is I suppose threefold. They're saying, look, first of all, they are safer for the environment, and they're looking at what is the whole life cycle of the compound. And they're looking at important factors like how quickly does it break down in the environment. So, once it's been used and it ends up in the waste process system or landfill or whatever it is, they are saying, okay, This has got to break down a lot quicker. It's got to be less toxic, etc. So that's one area that they are innovating in. The other area in terms of sustainability is they're saying rather than using cracked products from fossil fuels, which is where most of these chemicals originally came from, the feedstocks, we are turning to things like cornstarch, bioethanol, etc., which of course they still have an environmental impact when you are farming en masse, but it is a much more sustainable approach. It's not perfect, but it is a big step forward.
Okay, well, can you provide some color on the trends towards bio-based ingredients and the development of environmentally friendly or at least more sustainable chemicals?
Yeah, so I think the best way to kind of think about this is that if we sort of just in this kind of format, rather than dig into exactly what the chemical changes are, if we just say, look, they're using bioproducts rather than natural gas and fossil fuel products, and then we look at what's the end result. Well, the end result is this. You've got about, just to put this in perspective, a company like Croda is now producing about 60% of its chemical formulations, which it describes as sustainable and bio-based. A company like Itaconix, much smaller, bit of a startup, not well, more than a startup, but it's shaking the tree a bit in the sector. It's pretty much 100% of its raw materials are sustainable and bio-derived. Then when you look at the marketplace itself, the rest of the specialty chemical companies as a general group are producing about 20% of their specialty chemicals as bio-based raw materials, from bio-based raw materials. So what this tells us is that there is clearly enormous consumer demand for this. So there is a lot to go for. There's another really interesting thing about the way the chemicals industry, the specialty chemicals industry works, which is that broadly speaking, about 2% of their additives or products are responsible for the volume of what you're consuming, but they're about 5% of the value. So when you then take this and then you look at another interesting thing, and this is a thing investors have to really think about and understand about the sector, is the contract basis. So everybody is used to a pitch which says, this is a service on demand. Instead of selling the piece of software or selling the whole item in one go, you get charged every month. So we have repeatable revenues. We can't be substituted out. And, this is the goal, the holy grail sometimes, especially at the IPO level and things. Well, specialty chemicals doesn't work that way. And it sounds, when you first hear it, like it's a bad thing, but it's not. It's a great thing. So the way their contracts work is this. They don't have permanent contracts. They essentially have an agreement to supply a certain amount, and then when that amount is supplied, there's a new negotiation, a new agreement. So that's both on the raw material side, the stuff they buy in, and then they make their stuff, then they sell it on, and also the contracts are the same in nature there. So Unilever won't say to Croda, right, for the next 36 months, we want you to deliver 25 kilos or whatever it is per day of this product. That's not how it works. They say, here's our order, please deliver, etc. It works much more like that. So shouldn't be thought of as fixed long-term contracts. Should be thought of as very flexible contracts that are short. Why is that great? Because it sounds like a terrible, terrible thing. It's great because raw material costs have a high impact on the pricing. And when you've got inflation, it affects pricing and production costs. So you're able to go to your raw material suppliers at one end and say, okay, we need to negotiate this, or right, that's the new price. So then you go back to your end purchaser and say, here's the new price. Given that we are IP based, given that this is an innovative period, you are going to have to pass the cost on, or you're going to have to take our cost. So yes, the end buyer is cost sensitive, but the specialty chemicals companies are actually in quite a strong position. With this sustainability drive, what's happening is that the company branding and making the product and put it on the shelf, they are making claims about their brand to the consumer to address consumer demands. So you can imagine if you've got an IP-based product in your product so you can say those things, reformulating it out or switching it out and going back to, say, a nat gas fossil fuel product, that is quite a thing you've got to think about because you're damaging your brand potentially, or you have to reposition the brand. And this is why they're right in the middle there. And at this period, it's great. And you can get, the gross margins are rising. We would say 35% is a really, really good gross margin for this type of business. Itaconix is delivering 35%. I think Croda's possibly closer to 28, 29, but this is why we like it.
Well, that actually leads me into a great question. I've been very humble asking the question, but what sort of companies might investors consider spending some time on?
Well, as it happens, we really like the UK market. We think there are a few things here that can kind of trigger the imagination. One, we as a nation, we are still recognized as being fantastic at innovation and creating IP, etc. The specialty chemicals companies, they are really driven by science and R&D. Okay, and then they have all this IP, as we say, which is very, very valuable. It's a fantastic environment. And the UK market is definitely undervalued by a couple of turns. So it looks really good. So they're leading innovation. They're undervalued by a couple of turns. And we think, that will be closed over some kind of reasonable investing horizon. And so to give an example of two ends of the spectrum where you could go to, because there are about 10 you could look at in the UK that would be worth spending a bit of time on probably. And if you look at the two ends, you've got ITX right at the small micro cap end, innovative, 100% bio-based. And then you've got Croda. Sorry, and the other thing about ITX is currently it's got a limited number of clients. It had a bit of a shock, in fact, because it did get reformulated out. So it's changed its strategy now and it's going for a much broader, smaller group of clients, but it's less dependent. So it's, the revenue strategy has changed. Croda, on the other hand, has a huge number of products and a huge client base. And it's a mid-cap. And again, by any reasonable measure, it looks pretty undervalued at the moment. And there's one other little thing I wanted to touch on that's changed that I forgot to say earlier, Scott, which is that the advance of digital marketing has really changed the way these companies can sell and the extent of their market. So that profitable long tail, which was not available to them, is now suddenly available and makes sense. So if you are an independent retailer, think about the brewing market, different market, but lots and lots of new producers of small volume, small batch beers. It's the same thing is happening in personal care. You are getting these independent companies that are very small. Ordinarily, it would not make sense to try and market to them in the normal way with advertising, etc. But with digital marketing, it makes financial sense to do so. That in itself stimulates innovation because there's a place for these small companies to go where they've got expert formulation teams in the specialty chemicals companies, and they can say, I need my product to do this, and I'm going to make it look like this. And the specialty chemicals companies come back and say, sure, no problem. Here's what you need.
Fascinating, Christopher. Thank you very much for your time. I'm sure the investors are going to love this.
Thank you, Scott. I mean, it's always fun. So my pleasure.
For everyone else out there, good luck investing.